Today we're going to look at a track saw and we're going to look at a table saw, and we're going to try to decide which one is appropriate for different jobs. When would we use a table saw? When would we use a track saw? And are they appropriate for the same kind of jobs or for different jobs? First, I want to give you a little bit of a discussion of the makeup of a track saw. As you can see here, this is a long aluminum, in this case aluminum track, and the base of the saw, this being the saw, the base of the saw is built to fit tightly into this track. And what happens is we move the saw along the track. The track is very stable, and therefore the saw makes a very precise cut along the edge of the track. The way it works is that the blade is embedded in here, and as you use it, you push the blade down so that the blade protrudes far enough to cut through the piece of material that you're cutting. And by doing that, you can make a very, very accurate cut. And the reason it's so accurate is because this track and the way the saw fits into the track are very stable, and so they make a very, very straight cut. The other thing that's interesting about the track saw is that you can angle it over up to 45 degrees, and therefore you can cut a mitered edge, not just a 90-degree perpendicular square edge. So now let me demonstrate making a cut with the table saw. With the track saw. So let me demonstrate making a cut outdoors, and the significance of it being outdoors is that I can manipulate larger sheet goods that are very difficult to handle in the shop. I don't have a huge piece of wood here that I'm cutting, but you get the idea. Again, the setup is very similar, and I'm just cut this for you, and then we'll get back and talk about it. And there's your cut. We've taken a quick look at the track saw. Now let's take an equally quick look at a table saw. We do have videos that cover the table saw as well that you can go see, which go a little bit more in depth. But the basics of a table saw, it's again a circular blade, and the blade sticks up out of the table, and so you move the wood over the table surface and into the blade. Now the track saw, you'll remember, you actually have the blade, that you move the blade into the wood. You don't move the wood into the blade, and that's a significant difference. Now, there's two types of cuts that you can make with a table saw. You can make a cross cut, or you can make a rip cut. Cross cut is you're cutting across the shorter length of the board. So in this case, I would be pushing this into the blade, and I would cut across the wood, and it's called a cross cut. The other type of cut that you can do, you would remove this, of course, to do that, is to move this fence over fairly close, to some distance away from the blade, and then you would push the wood through lengthwise. That's called a rip saw. A rip cut on the table saw. And so what you're doing is you're taking a long piece of wood and making a cut along that long axis. Cross cut is taking a piece of wood and cutting across the shorter dimension of the wood. A track saw is not generally used for cross cuts with narrow pieces. It can be used that way. You have to brace it especially so that the track stays flat and stable. For that type of cut, really cross cuts, a table saw is probably safer and easier to use, but you still have to bring the wood to the saw. The other thing that you can do is you can angle this blade over to the side up to 45 degrees. Or anything in between vertical and 45 degrees over, and then you can make that cut rather than a square cut. You can make that cut. So now let me demonstrate making a cut with a table saw. So let's go through the basics of doing a cross cut. In a cross cut, you use this miter gauge in the miter gauge rail here, and you push into the blade and the blade cuts. And in this case, the waist will be on the right hand side. So the first thing we want to do is we want to measure the cut. Let's say we're going to take 1 inch off of there. So we'll measure 1 inch and make a pencil mark. And if you want to really be exact, you want to put the pencil mark on the edge of the blade, or the edge of the wood that's going to contact the blade. So next we need to set the depth of cut. And the way you set the depth of cut, the safest depth of cut, is so that these depressions or gullets in the blade are just above the thickness of the wood. So then we set up the teeth so that the saw kerf will be on the waist side of the mark, so that we're left with the full size that we wish to have. So next we want to put the blade guard in place. We want to turn on our dust removal equipment, safety equipment, turn the saw on. Push through and move like that. Turn the saw off. And after the blade has stopped spinning, then we remove the waste material. Next we're going to do a rip cut. And the first thing, as always, that we do is we measure. And let's say we want to take 1 inch off of this piece of wood. So on the end, we will measure out 1 inch. And make a mark. Then we line up the blade so that as we push through with the wood against the fence, the kerf will be on the waist side and we will be cutting right at our mark. Again, we are cutting to this particular height, which is a 1/2 inch, and you can see that we set that the gullet of the blade is just above the surface of the wood. That's the safest depth to use. We put this firmly, we make sure that the fence is locked down. We put the wood firmly against the fence, put the guard in place, and for this cut, because we have 5 or 6 inches here, we can use a push block like this to keep my hand up safely away from the blade. So we will turn on the dust removal, put on our safety gear, start the saw, and push the piece through. Note that I'm standing off to the left so that if something were kicked back, it wouldn't. So we turn the saw off, turn the dust equipment off, and there's your rip. So now we've seen the basics and discussed the basics of both the table saw and the track saw. And the table saw is definitely a more common tool and in wider usage than is the track saw. The table saw is very versatile. It is the centerpiece of most woodworkers' shop, but it is an indoor tool. You can get a contractor version of it, but you really need a truck to get it to the job site. So it's a little bit cumbersome to move to the site. So the table saw is definitely a tool where you bring the workpiece to the tool. Now it does an extremely good job, extremely accurate job of a wide variety of cuts, cross cuts, rip cuts, and I'm sure in our other videos you've seen dado cuts, etc. with a table saw. So it's very versatile, it's very stable, and it's pretty safe. So what's the difference with the track saw? The track saw basically can do the same kind of rip cut or cross cut depending on the dimension of the wood, but it can do it first of all at the job site, and that can be very important. It can be very important because when I go to do a job somewhere else, I can't take my table saw with me, but I don't just want to rely on a handsaw or some other less accurate device than this track saw. So that's why I own a track saw. Another reason I own a track saw is for very large pieces of wood, particularly sheet goods, that is, sheets of plywood. If I'm going to try to rip cut the 8-foot length of a sheet of plywood, first of all, I have to be able to lift it. Then I have to be able to lay it on the saw, and I have to be able to manipulate the on-off of the saw safely. And then without wiggling or jiggling, I've got to be able to maneuver that big piece of sheet good across this table saw. And I can tell you that that is very difficult, and especially if you're talking about 3/4 inch sheet goods. But I've demonstrated for you an outside cut laying on the ground on a sheet of insulation. Well, in that instance, I can take that 4x8 sheet of plywood and I can take it outside with my track saw at the job site, and I can make an extremely accurate cut with this device without resorting to the table saw at all. I would argue that I could do a fairly major piece of construction work at some site without my table saw if I had the benefit of a track saw. Track saws are not dirt cheap. Of course, table saws are expensive. Track saws are a bit expensive when you compare them perhaps to a plain circular saw, but the market is widening and there are more track saws on the market than there were just 2 or 3 years ago. And that competition is driving the price of track saws down. So you can get one for less than you used to be able to get them. So again, just to summarize, if you have the luxury of bringing your work to the saw, to the tool, then a table saw will do everything that you want to do. If the work is large, like a piece of sheet wood, sheet material, sheet goods, or you need to do the cutting at the job site, then something portable like this track saw can give you extreme accuracy on large pieces of wood and at a job site. So it may very well be worth the investment for you to have, in addition to a table saw, to have a track saw. Thanks for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed what you saw in our content, please hit subscribe.